everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining me today at the Cambridge Science Festival. My name is Dr. Nic Gibson, and as you will hopefully be aware, because you chose to come to this session, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about neurodiversity, kind of my personal experience of that, and hopefully help support you to understand that experience a little more, and perhaps maybe interpret your own experiences, those of your friends and family, or if you're just kind of an interested individual. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to attempt to run to time. I have a timer running. I am quite a chatty sort, so we'll do our best. But throughout this presentation, I also have some interactive slides. So that's both for the folks online, so that they can kind of engage with what's going on, but also so that you guys can kind of engage with what's going on as well. So hopefully this will feel more like a conversation rather than me just sort of talking at you. So a little bit about me. I was late diagnosed. So I was diagnosed about 3 and a bit years ago now. And I have a dual diagnosis. So I am diagnosed both ADHD and autistic. These diagnoses in and of themselves are both spectrums, and therefore they interact when you have them both in a variety of delightful, odd, and unpredictable ways. So I'll kind of touch a little bit on ADHD and autism separately, but I'll also talk a little bit about my experience of how that manifests in me as someone with both of those diagnoses. I'll touch a little bit on intersectionality insofar as I myself am non-binary, so I'm part of the LGBTQ community. And in fact, about 30% of folks who are diagnosed neurodiverse, or neurospicy, as I prefer to call it, are also members of the LGBT community. So there is a degree of overlap there. As with anything, these things obviously intersect with things like gender, age, culture, ethnicity, all of these things. So, I am obviously a white, assigned female at birth Scottish person. You can probably tell from the accent. I'm about as white as you can get before you turn pale blue. So obviously a lot of my experiences are coming from that positionality, okay? I will kind of touch on what I guess your experiences or thoughts are on ADHD and autism as we go through. But you've probably come across a lot of discourse about this online, right? Social media, TikTok, Instagram, all of that kind of thing. And I see these two kind of counter narratives quite a lot, that it's either some kind of superpower or it's a terrible tragedy. Hopefully I'm here to convince you it's neither of those things. It's just a different flavor of being human, okay? So we'll kind of touch on that. I'll be leaning more into kind of, I suppose, what we call the social model of disability. In other words, there's the clinical aspect of what it takes to be diagnosed. But the reality is, in many cases, the reason that neurospicy folks find the world difficult is just that the world is designed for people who are different to us. Yeah, so there's kind of social systems can be disadvantageous, but we have our own kind of strengths and capacities as well. I will attempt to be coherent, but I'm quite a chaotic person, so we'll do our best. I do also apologize. I'm very fidgety, hence you can probably notice it's very hard for me to stand still. If you find that distracting, please just ignore me. But I want to get a sense of where you are in relation to neurodiversity. That's what the ND stands for here. So just to kind of get a sense of who we have in the room, what your kind of frame of reference is, if you like. Obviously, I myself am neurodiverse. A lot of my friends are. I have a few colleagues here at ARU as well who are also neurodiverse. But broadly speaking, the rest of my family, as far as we know, are not, but, who knows? So, yeah, you can scan the QR code and then you can kind of interact with this. Quite often when I do sessions like this, I get a huge mix of people. Some people, suspect that they might be neurodiverse themselves. They might have friends and family or colleagues, various kinds of experiences there. Oh, I apologize. I thought the QR code would let everybody respond. I do apologize for that. It usually works, but my apologies.
I'd like to say I've noticed straight away. Interesting that you haven't got I'm self-diagnosed.
Yes. I suppose we can kind of say if you're self-diagnosed, maybe awaiting diagnosis. But yeah, you're right. I should have put that one in there. I kind of didn't want it to be too cluttered. It's like, you're trying to get as many sort of categories in there as possible. But again, I appreciate that for a lot of folks, you might be self-diagnosed because, again, being assessed is very difficult. there are long waiting lists, and there's also a certain degree of vulnerability around that decision depending on what your living situation is. So, we do kind of acknowledge and recognize that as well. I do apologize if you're not able to interact with the slides. I thought that the QR code would work, but apologies if that does not. Nevertheless, we'll have time for obviously some Q&A at the end as well. So if there's things that you want to kind of talk about that you're not able to interact with, don't worry, we'll have some time for that too. So there's a few of you here who are neurospicy yourselves or maybe self-diagnosed, and quite a few of you who maybe have friends, family, potentially also colleagues, obviously. Okay, so I want to touch a little bit on what kind of ADHD looks like more broadly. But I will kind of, for those of you who want to, whilst I talk about this, you can kind of put in what your understanding of that is. As you're probably aware, it's a neurodevelopmental difference. So this essentially means that you just develop differently. Your brain works differently in a lot of ways. It can present as a spectrum in a lot of folks. It often presents differently in women and girls and assigned female at birth folks than it does to assigned male at birth and men and boys. The age at which it's diagnosed varies a huge amount as well. So obviously I was diagnosed as an adult. Typically the difference in diagnosis usually is around how obvious it is in a classroom, right? So if you get diagnosed as a kid, it's usually because it's obvious in a classroom. If you're able to kind of manage yourself in the classroom, even if you kind of have a meltdown when you get home, it's much less likely to be picked up. Also, if you have what we call kind of internalizing, in other words, the difficulties and the struggles that you have are largely internal, as opposed to very externally observable things like fidgeting or running around, that's less likely to be picked up, yeah? So that's kind of often the disparity in diagnoses. But I will kind of get into that a little bit more later as well. Yes, the chasing the dopamine is very much a thing. Yeah, and you do tend to think differently and process the world differently in a variety of different ways. Broadly speaking, there's two types of ADHD, the inattentive, distractible kind, and the kind of hyperactive, impulsive kind. The reality is you can't really just have one without the other. If you're diagnosed as type 1 or type 2, that basically means that you have more of type 1 than any of type 2. If you're diagnosed as type 2, you have more of type 2 than any of type 1. I have the joy of being combined type. I'm basically about 50-50. So I get to have what we call the intersection of fire, I guess. I get all of those things. So you can notice I'm very fidgety. I can be quite impulsive. I am very distractible. And I do have kind of a lot of those difficulties. So generally speaking, historically, it's been easier to be diagnosed if you are biologically male than if you're biologically female. A lot of this is because most of our early diagnostic criteria are based on boys and men, usually because they often fall more into the impulsive hyperactive end, and it's therefore more obvious in a classroom at a younger age. For women and girls, it's often more internalizing the internal things, and so it's less likely to be picked up. There's also issues of something called masking and camouflaging, which I'll come on to in a little bit. And certainly this was kind of my experience as well. I was that kid, right, who was like, she's really smart if she could just stop daydreaming. I would fidget, I would doodle, all of those things. I was very distractible, I would go off on tangents. I say I would, I still do. And the funny thing for me is that despite being an actual psychologist and having nominally some understanding and expertise in this area and finding things like this incredibly relatable for literally years, it never occurred to me to pursue diagnosis at all. I kind of gaslit myself. You did fine in school. You managed to get a degree. You're an academic. You can't possibly have this going on, right? So I was kind of guilty of the same biases as the very people who would not have recognized it in me and would not have diagnosed me. Incidentally, if you find all this really relatable, again, not a diagnostic criteria, but you might want to talk to someone. Anyway, so, and I absolutely relate to this, right? I do feel chronically overwhelmed. I'm either overstimulated or understimulated. I'm sometimes completely shut down or I'm completely over the top, right? It's very much all or nothing, right? Also this. 2 types of work days. Get a week's worth of work done in a day, or a day's worth of work done in a week, right? And I don't get to choose what kind of a week I'm having. That's just how it's going to be. And that has particular challenges, right, for me, both. In school, it's a bit less of an issue. I would get stuff done, but I was that person who would be like writing the essay, that week, or like 48 hours before the deadline. And I spent my whole life convincing myself I would grow out of this, I would stop being that person. Well, I'm 46 now and I'm still that person, so I guess we're just gonna have to learn to live with it. But I at least now have an understanding of why I work like this, yeah? Whereas when I was younger, that was a lot harder for me to make sense of. Again, when we look at kind of autism, autism is also a hugely diverse spectrum, even more so than ADHD in many ways. It's actually quite difficult to categorize and define autism beyond resorting to things like clinical criteria, yeah? But the reality is that because it's such a huge spectrum, it can be even harder to diagnose in women and girls because, again, we once thought that ADHD and autism were things that only happened in boys and men and did not tend to happen in women and girls. This is partly, again, because of masking, which I'll come on to, but there's also things around the different socializations. There's some thought to be around different brain structures that might mean it manifests differently. There's a lot of arguments as to why that is, but the reality is that it does tend to look different in assigned female at birth folks or assigned male at birth. This kind of thing at the top here are kind of the 3 areas that we tend to clinically identify if you were to get a diagnosis. But the reality is it's not that you are less autistic or more autistic. You either are or are not autistic, and you can have different patterns of abilities or difficulties in widely diverse areas. And the reality is this can also move around a little bit. We tend to understand autism now in terms of level of support need. 1 with the lowest, 2 is kind of in the middle, and 3 is the highest level of support needs. And that can be with or without verbal ability. So I am a verbal autistic. I am able to articulate my thoughts and feelings. There are many autistic folks who are non-verbal, but that does not mean that they are in any way necessarily intellectually impaired. They are simply non-verbal, okay? And any of you who've ever gone on a holiday to a country where you didn't understand the language and no one understood you will hopefully appreciate the frustration of having complex, involved emotional experiences that you can't communicate to people and you can't be understood. So many nonverbal autistic folks get treated very badly because people tend to conflate being nonverbal with intellectual impairment, and that's simply not always the case. But this can shift around a bit as well. I would be classified as level 1, so low support needs, but that doesn't mean I have no support needs. And if I am really stressed or exhausted or overwhelmed, I start to look a lot more like level 2. And I can also have failures of capacity to verbalize. I will sometimes just not be able to talk because I'm overwhelmed and things just start to not work properly and shut down, which as a lecturer is super awkward sometimes. So I had to learn little tricks and kind of verbal things to say, I'm sorry, the words are not wording, I'll get back to you later. And I just had to learn these little responses so that I can kind of get through those situations. But it comes with a lot of kind of particularly sensory differences, as does ADHD. There is this kind of thing around the sort of this savant idea that if you're autistic, you're somehow a genius at certain things and terrible at others. You don't need to be a savant to be autistic, right? You just, again, you are wired differently, you process the world very differently to other folks. And there's also kind of this difficulty, there's quite a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism, as is in my case. Some of the diagnostic criteria are really similar, some of the difficulties are really similar, but often for different reasons. It's quite common if you have autism, that you may also have ADHD and vice versa, but you can have one without the other. But it is very difficult to be diagnosed with both. I was very lucky. So this is me, this is little me. I was born in the far north of Scotland in 1980, back in the day when, even north of Scotland tends to be a couple of decades behind the rest of the world at the best of times. So in the 80s, the idea of even things like ADHD and autism were not really commonly understood. Dyslexia was understood, anxiety was understood, depression was understood. But ADHD and autism, no. So there was no universe in which I would ever have been diagnosed anyway, regardless of my gender, regardless of my level of support needs. That would simply not have happened. But looking back, there were signs. So I was a very weird kid. I always felt a little bit like an alien. I really liked David Attenborough because I felt like David Attenborough. I felt like I was observing a different species that I didn't belong to. People were so nonsensical, so weird to me, they did not make sense. And I had to kind of learn effortfully what the rules were. It did not come naturally to me at all. In fact, I got sent to the headmistress in primary school with fairly monotonous regularity, but not because I was disruptive. I was a really well-behaved kid. I got sent to the headmistress because I argued with my teachers because they were wrong. I really liked dinosaurs, for example. In fact, all animals, lots of sciences. And one of my primary school teachers was telling us about a dinosaur. They quite transparently drew what I knew to be a stegosaurus, and they called it a triceratops, and clearly I can't let that go. So, you know, a very polite, but very insistent and quite stubborn argument ensued. Because I didn't understand that schooling is not just about learning, it's also about authority. Did not understand that social rule at all, wasn't backing down because I was right, didn't want anyone to get the wrong idea about dinosaurs because dinosaurs are cool. Why would you not want to be accurate about dinosaurs? Sent to the headmistress. Similarly, in secondary school, this also happened with my biology teacher. So, incidentally, these photos, I had to ask my mum for these. You'll notice that the only ones in which I am smiling have a stuffed toy or an animal. This is not uncommon. I had to learn how to smile for photographs. And in a lot of photographs, I have what can only be described as a manic grin. It sort of looks like I might be a serial killer. And it's because I didn't really know how to do photos, right? My natural thing when you pointed a camera at me was this. And this is sometimes called the neurodiverse stare. This flat, blank expression where I just freeze. And it looks very, very weird. I had to learn how to not do this. I still kind of suck at it, to be honest with you. I learned to ride a bike really late. This is my cousin Damon. Again, things like difficulties with coordination is really prevalent in sort of ADHD and autism. It took me a really long time to learn to ride a bike. It took me a really long time to learn how to tell an analog clock. Because left and right to me, I couldn't understand why this was 2 and that was past. That doesn't make any sense, therefore I don't understand, therefore I didn't learn it. So I needed digital watches, for example. My ability to do mental problem solving, like 3-dimensional mental problem solving, really, really good. My ability to parse my actual 3-dimensional position in space, horrible, very clumsy, absolute disaster. So, and it gets worse, incidentally, if I'm with someone. Because if I'm walking around with someone and talking to them, my attention's over here, and I just walk into things. It's ridiculous. It's very silly. So I had this very spiky profile of abilities, which is pretty typical in neurospicy folks. Really, really great, way above my reading age, my, whatever educational level in certain things, way behind in others. I did get a diagnosis of dyslexia, which is pretty common, and I did get some learning support for that. So I did have these classical issues of diagnosis, but possibly not for the reasons that would now be the case, right? It was just a very different time. Those things would not really have been looked for at all. But this is still a problem. And certainly if I was a kid now, I would still struggle to get diagnosed, right? Because ADHD can kind of hide autism in a lot of ways, and vice versa. They can, at least externally, it looks like they sort of average each other out. Internally, I can tell you they absolutely don't, but more on that in a moment. So hence me being diagnosed late. And typically, if you're late diagnosed, regardless of your sort of gender, whatever your age or situation, you're typically diagnosed when your ability to compensate, your ability to kind of come up with coping strategies to navigate a world that isn't designed for you, no longer works, where the demands exceed your ability to adapt and adjust. For me, that was in my 40s. But for other folks, that might happen earlier or later. A lot of folks end up getting diagnosed because they have kids. And suddenly the extra demands of being a parent, either one, your kid is diagnosed and you go, wait a minute, this sounds very similar to me when I was growing up, hang on. Or simply the extra demands of parenting exceed your coping capacities, and that's when you start to realize that you're struggling. I do not have kids myself, but obviously a lot of my friends and colleagues do. So this is me in the 90s and the 2000s. I was always a tomboy. I was always odd. That never really changed. At this point, I understood that there were things like nerds and goths. As you can see, a lot has changed. So at this point, I'm a teenager. It's already awkward being a teenager. It's even more awkward when you're extremely weird. Throughout university, again, you can see only smiling with the animals. I've always had pets and animals in my life. That's, again, quite a common thing for neurodiverse folks. Often kind of, you'll know about like pet therapy and so on, animal therapy. A lot of that is very helpful for neurodiverse folks because dealing with kind of neurotypical humans is a lot of effort. Animals are a lot easier. generally speaking, and they can be a huge support in that sense. So I was very weird. I have weird pets. I had weird pets. I used to have rats. I have even weirder pets now. I won't show you them because some people have phobias about the kind of pets that I have. If you want to ask about my pets later, feel free to do so, but I'm not going to traumatize anyone. I had a very small social circle. That was always the case from being very young to even now. I have a very small social circle of close friends. Spoiler alert, many of them have since been diagnosed neurodiverse. Again, if you find that most of your friends are neurospicy, not a diagnostic criterion, but you know, you might want to have some conversations with your GP. Just a suggestion. For a long time, this was my favorite photo of myself. There's a big gap where there's no photos of me at all. So from kind of about 10, 11 years old, there's a massive gap where there's no photos. There's a few photos of me at university age, kind of around here. This was my favorite photo of myself for a long time. Genuinely, unironically, I was like, oh, look, that's what I really look like. That's me in there, look at that. So, yes, again, I have slightly odd ways of thinking about the world. As I mentioned, I basically ended up finding out that almost all of my friends, at least all of the friends that I kind of was really close to and have retained, are either now diagnosed or are self-diagnosed or strongly suspect. So I would say if you find yourself in that position, you might want to have a think about that. And generally speaking, one of the things that I find is kind of characteristic about that is that if you find that on the whole, human beings are really exhausting, doesn't mean you don't like them, but they're super exhausting, except certain people who are kind of less exhausting and just sort of get you. Again, you might just be a nerd, you might just be an introvert, but you know, the Venn diagram of overlap between that and neurospicy is almost a single circle. So you might want to think about it. So there's a lot of overlap there. And there is an element sometimes of kind of like finding your tribe, right? A lot of neurospicy people will naturally gravitate to other neurospicy people because it's just easier to form friendships with people who kind of see the world in a not dissimilar way to you, especially when neurotypical folks see the world very differently to you and don't seem to relate to your experience at all. And you kind of find yourself going, what, really? You don't think about things like this? It's very hard often to bridge that gap in understanding. Especially, we have quite an interesting spread here. I love this. I often feel like when the neurotypicals make friends with the neurospicy folks, it's like the extrovert taking the introvert out for their mental health. There's kind of a bit of that going on sometimes, which I find really funny. I'm kind of what you would call like an extroverted introvert. I seem really extroverted, right? When I'm out, I'm out. People are great. I can engage a lot. That's kind of the ADHD doing its thing, but it's also super exhausting. And then I'll go home and like collapse and have to recharge for like several days, right? That's quite a common thing. And we do find that there are kind of complexities around friendships with neurospiciness. So in ADHD in particular, ADHD in general makes friendships hard just because, again, you see the world really, really differently, but also like maintaining friendships can be really difficult with ADHD because often there's what I kind of like to call like an object permanence problem, right? So one of the things about ADHD is something called time blindness, where you don't really perceive the passage of time in the same way. And you're often sort of mentally overloaded a lot. You're juggling a lot of things. You're very distractible. So weeks or months can go by when someone has texted me, and I'm like, oh yeah, I must reply to that. And then I get distracted, and weeks pass. And now I'm like, oh, dang, they think I hate them. This is so awkward. And I can't be like, oh, I didn't reply because I literally sort of forgot you existed for like a week. Because that's not, like, people take that really personally, it turns out. But it's kind of true, right? It's not that I don't value those people. I adore them. They're my friends. But I'm often overloaded. I'm often juggling a lot of things. And time just doesn't really seem to work for me in the same way as it does other people. So it can make it hard to maintain friendships and for those things to make sense. Hence, making friends with other neurospicy people can be easier. There's also, as I mentioned, that 30% overlap with the LGBTQ community. A lot of neurospicy folks are kind of gender non-conforming. They may not be, trans themselves or non-binary, but they'll often be quite idiosyncratic and not really, necessarily conform to the expectations of their gender in the same way as neurotypical folks do. And that can make things difficult, along with, again, just the general, you sort of see the world differently. So it can make it very hard. And I was bullied at school, a lot. Weirdly, some of the bullying I wasn't aware was bullying, right? Because autism. Because, that sort of passive-aggressive stuff, I just didn't pick up on. But I knew that people didn't like me. They didn't like me, they didn't invite me to things. I was kind of I was physically bullied a bit as well. But I just thought people were kind of mean, right? It's well, people are kind of mean and they don't like me. Oh, well, it's just because I'm weird, I guess, whatever. But a lot of it I didn't pick up on at all. Because again, I would get excluded, but I couldn't really parse why. And a lot of that passive-aggressive stuff would just kind of fly over my head. So in a weird way, I was very bullied. And some of it I was aware of, and some of it I wasn't aware of. And that's kind of odd. And I think in some ways the bits that I wasn't aware of is probably kind of a good thing, because I might have been more upset by it. But I kind of conceptualize it a little bit as I don't know, I don't really get people. They don't really get me. I guess that's fine. I had as I say, maybe one or two very close friends. And I just kind of was well, I like animals better, I guess. They just make kind of more sense to me. Humans I'll do my best to get along with, but, I guess we're just, I don't know, we're not compatible. That was kind of my thing. A lot of my friends, incidentally, were guys, which was interesting. And I think it was because, again, teenage girls can be quite mean, right? And they have a lot of expectations about how you perform girlhood. At least they did when I was growing up. I don't know if that's still the case now, but it was for me. And because I was weird, just girls did not know what to do with me. I was into mud and insects and weird things and getting dirty and climbing trees. And they're like, no, what is this? What do we do with this weird goblin child? Whereas a lot of the things that I was into, boys seemed to like more. So that was kind of easier for me to kind of connect with people. It's more even now, incidentally, but I think that's because I'm at a university and I'm surrounded by a bunch of nerds. It's a lot easier to make friends with nerds. They don't even need to be neurospicy, they just have to be nerds and you're fine. And again, this autistic thing of smaller, closer friendships. As a psychologist, I've now looked into the literature, I'm like, dang, I just feel like I'm being targeted. You know what I mean? I feel like I get called out by a lot of the literature I read, and that's been an interesting thing to kind of parse. And as I mentioned, there's kind of differences in sort of biological sex and the way that autism manifests. There's this theory called monotropism, which is what kind of explains the sort of hyper-focus thing, right? These few really narrow, intense interests. It's also thought that it might be responsible for the overlap between ADHD and autism. If you want to kind of ask me more about that later, I'm happy to dig into it. It's a bit of an emerging discourse in the literature, so it's kind of, it remains to be, I suppose, determined. But certainly I found this. I had sort of odd friendships. My friendships groups were around, and still are, around nerdy things, right? It was around, I don't know, video games and D&D and weird nerdy science things. That was how I formed my friendships. And that's still the case. It's just that I'm now at a university surrounded by a bunch of nerds, so finding people who have weird nerdy interests is it's like fish in a barrel at this stage. Small school in the far north of Scotland, desert for nerds, right? But I'm at a university, so I started to form a lot more kind of diverse friendships throughout university and since becoming an academic. That was just a lot easier for me. But I do still have struggles with this. I mentioned this thing about exhaustion, right? It's not that I don't like people. I used to think it was that I don't like people. It was that I had trouble relating to people and people had trouble relating to me, right? I actually really like people, but I also find humaning, as I call it, exhausting. It's a lot of work for me, especially in sort of mixed company. And by mixed company, I mean it's not all neurodiverse nerds, right? But also when you have larger groups of people. So interacting with, 3 or less people, fine. If they are good friends of mine and we're doing maybe an activity together or something like that, fine. Once you get to larger groups of people, that's genuinely really hard for me. It's not that I'm not having fun. I'm often having great fun, right? I'm that person who's I'm almost always at this doing okay, I'll make an appearance, but I might leave, right? The impulsive part of my ADHD will agree to things. People will go, do you want to come and do this thing? That sounds great. And then the day comes and I'm like, oh damn, but I actually have to do the thing now. I don't know if I want to do the thing now. I could just stay home. It's a lot of effort to do the thing. And I will literally be talking myself out to it whilst I'm getting my shoes on, right? Whilst I'm going. Whole way there on the train, I don't know if I want to go. Yeah, the whole way. And then I get there and I have a lovely time. And that's kind of why I make myself go, right? But it will still exhaust me. I will still end out, very drained, very tired, and then I'll need like a few days to just like not be around people at all to kind of get that back, right? And so I kind of joke that like past me and present me have a complicated relationship. Past me agrees to things and does not think about the fact that that responsibility is going to fall on present me. In fact, even this talk, I volunteered to do this like early this year, then promptly forgot about it, didn't think about it for months. And then a few weeks before this talk, I was like, oh yeah, I said I was going to do that thing, didn't I? Dang it, I'm going to have to do the thing. So there's that, right? There's a lot of that that I experience quite a lot. And again, I'm not saying that, that's unique to neurodiversity. A lot of introverts are going to experience that. But it is pretty much a consistent feature of neurodiversity, right? Regardless of whether you're having fun, regardless of the group size, it's effort, it's work. And again, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it does mean that we pay a higher cost for those things. And when you kind of take that alongside the higher cost that we pay just for existing in the world, of trying to translate, I often liken it to being a PC in a Mac world, or sorry, a Mac in a PC world. If you imagine everything is a PC, it runs on Windows, and you're a Macintosh. Most of the software doesn't run on you properly. You're going to crash out quite a lot. There's going to be a lot of extra work to get anything to run in the same way on you as it does on a Windows thing. But there are still things you're very good at that like a Windows PC cannot do, but they're less valued, or they're less emphasized, or they're less kind of built into our daily lives because almost everyone else is a PC, right? And that can be a lot of work just on the daily. So you can kind of have a lower battery anyway, and then doing extra things, even if you want to, even if they're super fun, is just kind of hard. And it can take a lot of effort. And I kind of refer to this as the discomfort of being perceived, right? What I mean by this is, I do really like people, I do. But that sense of being perceived, right, of being in a social situation, you're kind of always putting on a performance, right? And that performance is sort of filtering, adjusting, adapting yourself to avoid misunderstandings, to try and fit in, to try and kind of make sense of the world, to try and navigate things without causing problems or friction or difficulties, right? These are photos of, I don't do it as much now. When I first moved down here, I used to do these day city trips on my own. And the reason I did that is if I'm on my own, I can just sort of enjoy what's going on, especially if I go somewhere for the first time. If I go with somebody, even if it's someone I really like, I'm not really fully present in what I'm doing because I'm kind of managing my interaction with that other person all the time. So I used to go and do things on my own. But I used to take photos of stuff to, show friends and family I went to this place. And my mum, being a mum, you know what mums are like. How do I know that you were even there? Anyone could have taken this photo. Why aren't you in the photo? Right? I don't like photos of myself, or I didn't for a very long time. Again, there was that thing of like being perceived, right? It felt uncomfortable to be in a photo. So in my very kind of weird, literal thinking way, I suppose, I started doing this. So this is a Detective Pikachu, if you're not aware. Someone bought me this years ago because I like Pokemon. His name is Mycroft. If you get it, you get it. And I took him everywhere. And so he's in photos instead. I would just be like, look, I was here because there's Mycroft. So I would genuinely, unironically be wandering around museums, like placing a Pikachu and taking photos. And people thought I was some kind of like YouTuber or Instagrammer or something. I was like, no, I'm just really weird. Don't worry about it. It's fine. It's fine. So, as much as I say I would try and kind of filter myself and rein in the weird, you can see it leaks out, right? You kind of try and rein in the weird, but at a certain point, you can only contain so much of it, It's gonna kind of spill over. So this is what I used to do. And I still kind of do this sometimes, actually. And it's become a thing now where my mum genuinely is like, why don't you take Mycroft out anymore? It's become a whole thing. It's like a whole shared joke now, which is quite fun. Now, I mentioned that, life is hard, and humans are hard, and humaning is hard. And I alluded to something called masking. And this is essentially what I mean. It's this idea of kind of adjusting yourselves to fit in with social rules that don't come naturally to you, that you don't really fully understand. You kind of had to effortfully learn them, and you're sort of trying to adapt to them all the time, right? And adjust to them all the time. And we call this masking or camouflaging. It's very, very common in low support needs autism. It's very, very common in what we call sort of like high masking, like ADHD and autism, whether you are, assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. It's slightly more common in women and girls and AFAB folks, but it is a very common thing. So much so that there's now a questionnaire for it called the CAT-Q. It's a masking questionnaire. It was originally designed for autism, but it's now also being used with ADHD folks as well. So if you feel like that sounds incredibly relatable, QR code, you can take the CAT-Q if you like. But this is kind of responsible for some of those energy drains, right, on dealing with the world as a neurospicy person. And I've kind of experienced this my whole life, but I didn't really parse it in that way. I didn't sort of understand why. I just sort of figured out that humaning was hard and I was kind of bad at it, right? That was sort of my understanding of the situation for a very long time. There's incidentally some research. I mentioned this thing about like neurospicy people talking to neurospicy people. It's easier. There's actually some research that backs this up. That certainly in sort of lower support needs neurospicy folks, if you pair them with other neurospicy folks, this sort of deficit in social communication does not seem to be as pronounced. So it does literally appear to be like neurotypical folks and neurospicy folks are almost speaking a different existential language. And that's where the misunderstandings come from. But because most people are neurotypical, it's seen as a deficit. You are bad at this. But no, we just do it very, very differently. And because that's not the common way of doing it, we get misunderstood a lot. There's a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misunderstanding. Think about trying to literally speak a second language that you're not very good at. Literal misunderstandings, but if you speak to someone who speaks the same language as you, much less of an issue, right? And increasingly, the literature does back this up, and that's certainly been my experience. And there's something like kind of what we call like neurospicy-dar. You've all heard of like the idea of like gaydar. The funny thing for me is when I was diagnosed, I still get some people being like, but you don't look autistic or you don't look ADHD. And one, what does that even look like? But also, I'm like, I think you'll find I do. Because genuinely, I am a university lecturer. And I guarantee you, when I do a lecture, every single neurospicy student in that room, even if I don't tell them I'm neurospicy, comes up and goes, so you're neurospicy, right? I'm like, yeah, I am. Yeah, I am. You just kind of know at some point. You just kind of know. So, game recognizes game, I guess, to a certain extent. Now, I will qualify the fact that when I say masking, we all mask to some extent, right? Like, we all present a version of ourselves, like at work, in particular situations, right? You're not your complete unfiltered self all the time. I imagine for many of you that would be a bit of a disaster, right? I'm sure many of you have things that you would love to say to your boss and your coworkers that would not advance your career, right? Or even friends and family that you're like, I really want to take the filter off because damn, but you know what? No. The key thing here is everyone masks a little bit, right? But for most neurospicy folks, they're doing it literally all the time, right? Like literally whenever they are around other human beings. So it's constant. Unlike folks that are like, oh, I mask quite a lot, I filter myself a lot at work, but when I go home or when I'm with my friends or family, I don't do that, right? For many neurospicy folks, they're doing it constantly. I know that I am. And since being diagnosed, I've had to work really, really hard to try and stop doing it. And it's really difficult. I've done it my whole life. It's really hard to drop the mask and stop doing it because it's how I've managed to cope with the world for 40-some years. And the weird thing is that with ADHD, it's very hard to learn habits, right? Like some people are like, oh, you develop a routine and you'll do it forever. No, not me. I can develop a routine, do it for months, years. If I miss one day, I will never do it again. I have to forcefully make myself brush my teeth. I do not have an autopilot at all. I need to effortfully make myself do things all the time. So again, takes extra effort, takes extra energy. So generally speaking, everyone's going to do it a little bit, but for neurospicy folks, you're often doing it all the time. And interestingly, one of the things that catalyzed this for me is when I moved down here for work, it was the first time I'd ever lived on my own. Never lived on my own before. I lived at home with my family, then I was at uni and like you share a flat, then I was after uni and you're kind of sharing flats because, living is expensive. It wasn't until I moved down here that I lived on my own. And suddenly I had this sense of just peace and solace and recharge that I'd never had before. And I realized then it was the only time that I wasn't masking, that I just stopped doing it altogether. And incidentally, as with a lot of neurospicy folks, that's why I struggled after COVID, not during it. COVID was horrible. Lockdown was great. Not having a legitimate excuse to not human at all, and not have to explain yourself or feel bad about it, heaven. Heaven. But then having to go back to doing that, being really out of practice, again, don't develop routines, disaster. Really, really disastrous for me. I had a massive burnout and just basically burned out completely, which is what led to my diagnosis, funnily enough. Anyway, before I was diagnosed, I also went to a lot of nerdy conventions. And this is interesting to me because on reflection, and now speaking to a lot of my nerdy friends, the cool thing about going to conventions is you dress up as someone else and you literally put on a mask, which ironically, for neurospicy folks, means you get to stop masking. Because the normal rules don't apply anymore. You don't have to be you, the socially acceptable you. You're not you, you're a character. And so suddenly, ironically, you get to be more you in situations like this than you actually often get to be in your daily life. And so I met a lot of very nerdy, very neurospicy people at cons and things like this. And again, because shared nerdy interest is a very neurospicy thing, but these kinds of spaces allow you that kind of freedom that you often don't get in everyday life. And that's certainly been something that I kind of miss. I don't do it as much these days. I sort of wish that I did. So my experience of ADHD and autism is odd, as I've mentioned, because they kind of interact. But interestingly, because I've been diagnosed, I'm now on ADHD medication. And as I've mentioned, ADHD and autism kind of are in this tug of war inside all the time, which means that it's maybe less obvious externally, but internally it's kind of this chaotic tug of war a lot of the time. But being on ADHD medication, weirdly, has almost like turned the volume down on the ADHD. It's not gone away, but the volume is turned down a little bit, but the autism isn't. So oddly, some of my autistic experiences are now more obvious because I'm on ADHD medication than they are when I am not on medication. And that's been a really interesting adjustment, let me tell you. So for dual diagnosed folks, that can be a complicating factor of whether you decide to be on meds or not. Being on meds for ADHD is a game changer, not gonna lie. I didn't know that it's possible to just set an alarm, get up, have breakfast, get dressed, leave the house. This has never been my lived experience. I have to set like 5 alarms. They will all be snoozed multiple times. I will drag myself out of bed. I will get ready. On the process of doing that, I will have decided what I want to wear, but then I can't find a specific thing, so then I go and try and find that specific thing, end up on a side quest, because, I needed to tidy that away, and actually, yeah, okay. Oh, damn it, I'm running late, I need to get dressed. So I get dressed, okay, fine. I leave the house. Damn it, I've left my phone. Okay, I gotta go back, I gotta get my phone. Late for everything. But I used to overcompensate. I used to try to be early, and then I would end up being either on time or a teeny bit late. But it was chaos. It was a huge amount of effort. ADHD medication, first time in my life, I just got up, got my stuff, left the house. I was in shock. I was literally at the train station. I live in Ely. I was at the train station messaging my colleagues, being like, why did no one tell me that people just leave the house in the morning? You all have been holding out, and we had no idea this was even a thing that you could do. And that has helped me understand that I have been playing my life on hard mode all the time and had no idea because you've got no frame of reference. You don't realize that you're expending all this extra effort until suddenly you're expending a little bit less. And you suddenly go, oh, dang, this is kind of nice. I can actually I can clean my house and make dinner as opposed to one or the other. It's amazing. So I've mentioned a thing about time blindness and so on. There's something that I call ADHD tax, which is I am incapable of keeping gloves, scarves, or umbrellas. I lose things, I break things all the time, no matter how hard I try. I have now given up on having umbrellas. It's just not worth it. Again, for a long time, I used to try and, be like other people. Other people can keep umbrellas. Why can't you do this? If you just try harder. Ever since I've been diagnosed, I'm like, no, do you know what? I'm not planning for the person I want to be. I'm just going to plan for who I actually am. So we're not doing umbrellas. We're not doing it, right? We're just going to get coats with hoods. That's what we're doing. We're not doing this at all. So there's various workarounds that I've had to come up with. I cannot carry a wallet. I will lose it. But I'll never lose my phone for some reason, even though I'm not really on social media. But for some reason, I never lose my phone. But that means I just have one thing to keep track of. And I don't lose it, and I can chain it to myself, and that's great. So I don't carry a wallet. I have to tap everything, because the number of cards that I have lost in my life that has then cost me money is ridiculous. So again, workarounds. I get very easily distracted, but I can go from being interested in something to an expert in it in like a week. I can't be normal about things I like, right? There's just no way that's going to happen. If I'm not interested, there's no way I'm going to get to any level of expertise. I'll always find it hard. But if I am interested in something, I will be an expert in it in like a couple of weeks. Easy, easy. And this is a very common thing of both ADHD and autism. ADHD, usually you switch between lots of things, like you'll be super into something and then you abandon it forever. Because I have both, I don't abandon any of them. And I have entirely too many hobbies and not enough time for any of them. But I just collect them. And I'll kind of rotate through them based on what time I have. But I never give up on any of them because autism. It's a whole thing. But it means that I end up being an expert in a lot of weird, completely unconnected things, which is really funny as an academic, because I will be in like meetings or whatever, and I'll suddenly go off on a tangent about something. And people will be like, how do you know this? I don't know what to tell you. How do you not? How can you be normal about things? How can you not do a deep dive every time you're remotely interested in something? But it does make it difficult too, because I don't get to choose what rabbit hole I'm going to dive down, and I'm not necessarily able to pull myself out of it, right? So when I happen to hyper-focus on something that's actually useful, like for work or daily life, great. Let me tell you, that's often not how that works. Okay, usually it's something completely unrelated. I am having a wonderful time. I end up with a whole load of really cool skills. Almost none of them are relevant in day-to-day life. It's very niche things. But I can solve almost any problem in possibly the weirdest way that you've never thought of because of that. I do have a degree of social obliviousness, as I mentioned, like when I was being bullied, and I still kind of have that. Like I'll be in a conversation, carrying on with the conversation, and then I leave and go, oh, that's not what they meant at all. Oh, dang. They're going to think I'm so weird. Because I'm just kind of like, I will often interpret things quite literally. It took me a really long time to understand idioms, you know those weird phrases? So things like, oh, I'm going to see a man about a dog. I genuinely thought people were like taking their animal to the vet. I did not know that that was a whole thing, right? The cordial that you get, like the diluting sort of cordial, on the back it says dilute to taste. As a kid, I genuinely thought that meant if you didn't dilute it first and you tasted it, it was like toxic or something. Very literal interpretations of certain things. And it means I have a very weird sense of humor. I do understand irony and sarcasm. It's some of my favorites. But if I don't know you well, I won't know if you're being sarcastic. If I know you, I'll work it out. But like sometimes I don't. I was on a train a few years ago. Friend of mine, going to a gig. We had some extra friends there too. And my friend's sitting next to me, and they nudged me. I was like, stop doing that. It's like, doing what? Turns out, when these other people I didn't know well were talking, I was staring really intently at them. They're like, you're being weird. But it was because I was just trying to parse, like, what does this emotion look like on their face? What do they mean when they're doing this? Because I'm having to work it out all the time. And I don't really know that I'm doing it. I just kind of do it automatically. But they're like, you're doing the stare. Like, oh, damn, sorry. Okay, I'll stop. So things like that can kind of be difficult, and it can make you come across as a bit of an oddball. Thankfully, I'm around a lot of oddballs, so it's okay. There's also a lot of kind of sensory things that can make things difficult. When I was being diagnosed, it was very funny. My psychiatrist was like, okay, we're going to assess you for autism as well. And I was like, oh, no, I don't think I've got autism. And they were like, okay, but do you have like sort of weird sensory things? And I was like, no, not at all. And they're like, okay, how do you feel about socks? This precipitated a 10-minute rant. And they were like, okay. So this is the other thing about being like low support needs and having learned how to mask and compensate your whole life. Like I didn't realize that these things counted at all. Because the way that it shows up in me is very idiosyncratic to me, but it's also not the way that I would have learned from a textbook that it shows up, right? So you're kind of blind to it in a lot of ways. But there's also this kind of thing, I've talked a little bit about the intersection of ADHD and autism, but there's also the fact that like delightfully, because I need more things to juggle, right? So it turns out that if you're assigned female at birth, your hormone cycle can change your symptoms. So your symptoms will be higher or lower at certain times of your cycle. And when you hit menopause, they all get dialed up to 11. And you might suddenly get symptoms you didn't have before. And also, your ADHD medication that you were totally doing fine with right up until then will just stop working altogether. And you have to switch to a different medication, which nobody told me. But I sure know about now. So that was fun. So there's a lot of things there that can make it difficult. There's also things around like interoceptive issues. Like, I can sometimes misinterpret pain as itching. Like, I'm clumsy, I bump into things, I get scrapes all the time. I don't even notice that I'm doing it because I don't feel the pain at the time. My attention is really bad. But then I might have a little scrape. I don't know I've got a scrape. And I'll interpret that discomfort as itching. I'll scratch my leg and go, oh, my hand's all covered in blood. Dang it. And then, you're like at a cafe with a friend or something and they freak out. You're like, no, it's fine. Honestly, it's fine. I'm not dying. I'm just dumb. I just have weird sensory things. So things like that can be difficult, and it can mean that you might not pick up on health things or miscommunicate health things. So that can make life a bit complicated, frankly. I've mentioned the idea of exhaustion. Has anyone come across spoon theory? Give me a show of hands. Oh, good. A few of you understand spoon theory. This is not exclusive to neurodiversity. This kind of comes from the invisible disability community. And it's this idea that you have a certain number of spoons. Think about the cutlery in your kitchen, right? You have a certain amount of cutlery. If you have a load of people over, you've now run out of cutlery. You've used it all. You cannot have people over until you wash all your cutlery, or nobody gets to eat. And the idea here is your spoons are your energy levels, right? So you have a certain set number of spoons, and different activities will have a higher or lower spoon cost for you. So if you only have N number of spoons, you have to decide how you're going to spend them, and when you run out, you run out. I have genuinely had days where like work's been really busy that week, it's been really exhausting, I go home, I flop on the sofa, and I do not function as a human for like a day or so. And when I say not function, I mean like I'm hydrating and going to the bathroom and doing nothing else. I'm not eating, I'm not getting up, I'm not doing anything, because I literally can't. I have no spoons left, brain says no. We are shutting down, defragging, and rebooting. You do not get to do anything. And I've had to learn where that hard limit is, because otherwise you get into this boom-bust cycle, right? You push yourself to do things when you feel good, you run out, you shut down, you fall behind on everything. Then when you recover, you have to do more to catch up, and you end up in this self-defeating cycle. And I've flip-flopped through that for a lot of my life. I've had to learn how to stop doing this. I still do it sometimes, but I'm getting better at not doing this. But again, it's something to be aware of if you are neurospicy or if you have neurospicy people in your life. Sometimes they'll be like, no, we can't hang out, we can't do anything. I'm not functioning well today. So I've mentioned this internal tug of war. What I will do, though, because I don't want to kind of overrun, we have a little bit of time for questions. What I will say is, being diagnosed and going through this whole little journey of mine, this is what I'm like in photos now. I don't mind having my photo taken anymore. I'm a lot more comfortable in my skin. I have found my tribe. I'm a lot more comfortable with all of the nerdy things and all the ways in which I am weird. I don't bother trying to hide it anymore, albeit learning how to dismantle a mask notwithstanding. If you're interested, this is my LinkedIn. I'm almost never on it, though. I'm really bad at social media, but by all means, hit me up. This is my Instagram. It's got nothing to do with my actual job. It's just weird, arty, and crafty stuff that I do, because, again, a million hobbies, but if that's your jam, feel free to check it out. So what I would say is that all of neurodiversity is a spectrum. It's just a different way of being a human being. However, one of the most difficult things about being neurospicy is a lot of people would be like, but you seem fine, or but you don't seem like insert thing here, or but why do you need that support? But why? Please just believe us. Honestly, if someone is neurospicy and they are telling you, I need this or that, it's very difficult to out yourself. It's a very vulnerable, risky thing to do. And it's often very difficult to figure out what support you need, and it carries a lot of social stigma to ask for it. I still sometimes struggle to ask for help myself, even though I know I should know better. So if someone does come to you and say, it's like this, just approach it with compassion, curiosity, and just common humanity. That's what we all want, right? We navigate the world in very different ways. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's cool. I used to feel bad about how weird I was, and now I'm like, no, actually, this is kind of awesome. I kind of like it. And I think that's really the important thing here. Everyone's version of neurospiciness is going to look different. But if we just are human to each other and meet each other where we are, I feel like everybody wins. So thank you for indulging me. If you do have any questions, comments, clarifications, thoughts, either raise your hand, or if you're able to use the QR code, please feel free to do that too. But yeah, I will throw open the floor. I think we have someone at the back there. Oh, sorry, we have someone at the back there. If we can get the mic. Yeah, lovely. Apologies, I'm kind of all the way over here, so I don't want you to like strain your voice trying to kind of shout out.
What were your pets?
So I have 5 snakes and 9 giant African land snails. I refer to it as the legless zoo. And 5 snakes, you think that's a lot of snakes, right? It's not as much as you think. Snakes are pretty low maintenance. 5 dogs is like a lot of pet to deal with. 5 snakes, pretty easy, pretty easy. Oh, thank you, that's so kind. That's so lovely. I'm never sure when I do these things what I'm actually going to say, and I'm never sure how coherent I'm going to be. So like, yeah, that's a really interesting thing. So folks who are on like gender-affirming care, who are taking hormones, that can be a really complicated thing. Because you have the added adjustment of like taking hormones and you're kind of like going through puberty again, but like as an adult. And the way that that intersects with whatever your neurospicy diagnosis is. So that adds kind of an extra level of, if you like, chaotic randomness as to what that's going to look like for you. One of my close friends from school, I've known her since we were 16. So she is a trans woman, and she is also neurospicy. And the phone calls we have had whilst she was transitioning were very, very funny. What I can tell you is it will probably make it a little more complicated, and some of the symptoms that you've been managing will change. They might get better or worse, they might go away, you might get different ones, but it's often hard to separate that from what the hormones are doing on top of it. So usually it's just kind of a chaotic transitional space until everything sort of settles down and you can kind of get a clearer picture of what's this going to look like now. So there's a kind of chaotic liminality, if you like, that goes through that. And so, but it is difficult because it's hard to get care as a neurospicy person, it's hard to get care as a trans person. You intersect those two things and it can be really difficult. So I would say like reach out to people, like find your tribe, find people going through similar things and just get a sense of like what this might look like or feel like. That's a really interesting question. And I think I'm still kind of unpacking that, to be honest with you, because there's part of me that's like, oh, my life would have been so much easier if I'd been diagnosed sooner. But I'm not sure that's true necessarily, because I think because I was low support needs, I think if I'd had a diagnosis at that age and at that stage in us as a culture, I think that would have shut a lot of doors for me. So I think in a way, I was sort of lucky in an odd way. I do wish I was diagnosed sooner, maybe as an adult though, especially since like becoming an academic and finding that I was like struggling with a lot of things and I couldn't understand why. So my career's kind of moved a lot slower than a lot of my colleagues because I couldn't understand why they seemed to find doing this easy and I was finding so many, straightforward things hard. But I think in a way, I try to look at it as it's allowed me to at least have a frame of reference, right? I now understand, and it now gives me a lot more capacity than I had before, but I think it also gives me a lot of empathy for folks who are struggling. I think I know what it's like to struggle like that. So when I see students or other folks struggling like that, I'm like, so, you want to have a little chat? Because I think there might be some ways that can help you. So, and I think like having to figure out how to compensate and cope without a diagnosis has luckily for me given me a broader set of coping strategies. They don't always work, I still get overwhelmed. So I kind of try and look at it like that, I guess. Oh God, that's such an interesting question. Really weird, really weird. I can get a really good vibe check on someone, but I can't really tell you why. But at the same time, I also do really dumb things. It's that contradiction of ADHD and autism, right? Like, I will do really oddly, like, complicated or risky things, but then I also sort of plan for my own incompetence, if that makes sense. So it's very, very weird. It doesn't stop me like getting into, potentially odd situations, but I've always got an escape hatch, is the thing. So it was very strange. But at the same time, I grew up in a small rural community where everybody knew everyone. So like my experience of risk is going to be very different to someone maybe growing up in like a city, right? So I was kind of lucky in that sense. I was from a very small community. So actually, my exposure to risk was pretty low anyway. Oh, thank you so much. I love that. I do try to do that. I kind of want to make sure that everyone can at least get some sort of engagement and involvement. We do our best here. I know what it's like. Sometimes I do not. Oh, lovely. Another 80s kid. Yes. Yeah, I do love the 80s fashion and that sort of stuff is coming back. Because now everyone's like, you're so fashionable. It's like, I haven't been for the last several decades, but if you stopped clock, right? If you wait long enough, circles back around. So that's been kind of fun. Yes, Halloween is my favorite holiday, partially because golf, right? But also that you do get to kind of dress up, and I think that's really fun, and I love that. So yes, Halloween is the best holiday, hands down. So yes. But thank you all so much for joining me today. If you do have any other questions, comments, thoughts, I'm very happy to answer them. We can kind of go out into the atrium and have a chat. I don't want to kind of overrun too much. I know that our wonderful tech team, and thank you all. Give us a round of applause for the tech team. Thank you all so much for making all of this possible so that folks can join us both in person and online. We appreciate you guys, but they will need to set up for the next lot of folks. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to see you all. Thank you.